And so to start tonight, I'm just going to give a quote from the Migration Policy Institute, a research organization. And it says, displacement is almost always a result of a complex mix of factors. People can adapt to changes in governments, and a few other powerful actors can influence what kind of movements take place in response to environmental changes. Some of the common root causes of migration include political violence and persecution, war and civil unrest, and natural causes like famine and flooding. And so whether someone believes that climate change is the result of human action or part of nature or some combination of both, there's no denying that the changing natural environment is causing people around the world to be displaced. Additionally, some sources of unrest that aren't traditionally thought to be climate related, such as war or political violence, can actually be the result of resource scarcity and competition. Migrants might say they're fleeing war, but they might not realize that war is being fought over access to fresh water, for example. Currently, there are over 100 million people living in low elevation coastal zones, which are at risk for rising sea levels. And already we are seeing the greatest worldwide migration displacement since the end of World War II. So it is already a tremendous, challenge, and one that could potentially get even greater exacerbated in the years to come. With things like floods in Libya, the fires in Hawaii, famine in the Horn of Africa, extreme heat in South Asia, the list goes on. It's clear that the natural environment is affecting the way that people move around the world. And so what this evening is about tonight is kind of this intersection of climate change and migration. And with that, I want to give our distinguished panelists a chance to introduce themselves and explain where they live, where they work, what kind of work they do, especially as it relates to immigration and or climate change. So Crystal, we'll go ahead and start with you. So please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Tobin, and thank you to all the panelists and all of you for being here to listen in tonight. I'm by no means an expert, but I'm here to model what it looks like for ordinary people to engage in these kinds of important conversations. I've been living in Portland, in Maine, since I was 5 years old, and grew up in poverty in and around Portland. I recently moved to North Yarmouth because I was priced out of Portland, and work with an organization that I founded in 2020 called Presente, Maine. And I founded Presente after really struggling and working in community my whole life, seeing some of the impacts of not only climate devastation, but political violence in our countries of origin, and how that plays out when people come here to Maine. So I think I'll leave it at that for now and pass it back. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Safiya, do you want to go next?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Safiya Khalid. I am the founder and executive director of Community Organizing Alliance, a social justice and civic engagement organization, nonprofit here in Lewiston, but also doing work in Portland. I've really been engaged in politics and grassroots organizing since college, and in 2020, I really engaged, and I was a city councilor for the city of Lewiston, but took a step away from that to go back to community and support individuals, new Mainers and BIPOC, but especially youth, and integrating into the Maine society and into schools and such. And I'll stop there, but super excited to be here with you all.
Thank you, Safiya. Kristina.
Thanks, Tobin. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kristina Egan. I'm the Executive Director of the Greater Portland Council of Governments, and we are the regional planning agency for 30 cities and towns in this area, from Portland extending up to Freeport and around Sebago Lake and further south. And we do a lot of work looking at the future and trying to figure out what's coming our way and get prepared for it. So I am very glad to be talking with everyone about this tonight. We do a lot to try to help communities take action on climate, to help them become more resilient. And we've also been actively engaged with welcoming asylum seekers to the region, particularly looking for shelter and longer-term housing solutions for the new arrivals. Thanks, Tobin.
Thank you, Kristina. All right, so with that all said, we'll just go ahead and dive right into our questions for the panelists. Crystal, I'm going to start with you. So starting off, I'm going to share a quote from Manish Bapna, who is the president and CEO of the Natural Resources Defense Council. And she says, those most vulnerable are least responsible for the crisis often, have the fewest resources to recover, and little political power. World leaders must respond with greater ambition on climate action, accountability for the promises they've made, and equity in our solutions. So, Crystal, can you explain a little bit about the justice issues that underlie climate migration? What causes some people to flee their homelands? And does the U.S. have a responsibility to take in people who need a safe place to live?
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that quote. Yeah, I'm really glad you said that. I wanted to highlight tonight some of the people that I'm in community with. The majority of them are from Central America, from the Northern Triangle, from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And despite contributing less than 0.2% of the global carbon emissions, they shoulder a disproportionate amount of the environmental burden. And so I really wanted to talk about the intersection of not only climate devastation, but the complex political and economic situation in these countries. That's really a result of bad U.S. policy. So, on top of warming oceans, that has led to more intense storms, increased intensity of storms, and changes in precipitation that has meant devastation for crops across the region, including beans, coffee, and corn, and increasing hot and humid conditions that have led to droughts that are causing devastation for season after season, that leaves subsistent farmers and farmers who are working for a wage losing their livelihoods. We also see big companies from US, big agriculture swooping in, stealing lands and taking what were once rich, local agriculture to huge monocrops of palm and soy and corn. And so you not only see the economic losses for those small farmers, but displacement where they have nowhere to go, they have nothing to eat, and they have no way to continue to sustain their livelihood. And so what you see is a huge influx in migrants from the region who I call it forced migrants, right? Like, I think sometimes here we think of these immigrants as, following the American dream, that they have this huge desire to be here, but why would people want to leave their homes in such huge droves if they didn't have to? And people in my community, I'm listening to stories every day, right, where they're coming from Honduras, walking through devastating conditions in the desert to present to police officials at the border just to find something else because they don't have food and they have no way to sustain their families. And oftentimes they're paying huge costs to be able to be trafficked to the border. And we see this most happening with subsistence farmers and indigenous populations that are most impacted by the climate-related damage to harvests. And another thing that I wanted to speak about was that I want us to shift the narrative from one of inclusion and humanity to acknowledging the centuries of military coups and corporate plundering and theft of lands, and really think about how it's our duty and it's our obligation to respond. It's not a kindness and it's not being generous. It's something that we must do. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crystal. Safiya, I'll have you go next with the theme of what are the stories of people who do end up seeking refuge here in Maine? And for that, I'll begin with a quote from Michael Chertoff, who's a former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security. He said, "When resilience and adaptation are not possible, we need to think globally about how we can provide safe harbor for people who can no longer live in a certain place." So kind of just building on the foundation that Crystal provided about kind of the underlying justice issues around climate-based migration. Safiya, can you share an example or two of successful immigration of people who are new to Maine? And how would you like to see Mainers be more welcoming in the future based on what you've seen in the past?
Okay. Oh, I got muted. I'm not muted. Okay, I think I heard your question about integration. Thank you for that question. You know, I lived in Maine since I was a kid, immigrated from Somalia at the age of 5 with my family. And we lived here since early 2005, and we don't see ourselves leaving. And that it's a successful story of integration itself. Many people that I grew up with were not also born here. Many of my friends were not also born here. There have been many challenges. I'm also sometimes I also focus in the city of Lewiston. There we do have our challenges, but over the years since I lived here, I've seen many successful stories. When we came here in 2005, there were many Somali Americans, many immigrants who lived here, who moved to different states across the country, to Minnesota, Ohio, Seattle, etc. But there are also many people who have immigrated here from other states because of safety, because of the economic opportunity, because of wanting to grow their family here, because of school opportunity, education. So there's so many opportunities that people have moved here and continue to stay. Couple of examples is, we see in Lewiston and actually across our state, many new Mainer population and immigrant folks have started nonprofits and have started new businesses such as car detailing, or nonprofits that focuses on substance abuse and opiate crisis, or such as Crystal has mentioned, she founded Presente as well. And me finding, I never have thought coming from Somalia because of civil war and immigrating here for safety and for opportunity and for the American dream, that, and my mom and me being the first in my family to go to school, right, get a car, be the first in everything, and now getting a master's degree. Never have I thought coming to Maine I would start my own nonprofit. That itself is a success. That's a successful story right there. And there's so many more that we don't see, that's not in the spotlight, that many people are succeeding in so many ways. Yes, we do have, we made progress. There's so much more progress to be made. from economic integration, I already mentioned that, but even at the municipality level and at the state level, state agencies definitely need to do more hiring people of color and bringing people who speak multiple languages, because it's still a struggle. People feel that their government, it's not reflective of their community and of their background. So how do we do that? We need to create a representative and reflective democracy so that we can, create that true integration. And that's not happening right now. And of course, we have, we'll hopefully make that progress in the future and work on that. My story also itself is, being the first Somali American city councilor, that itself is a step towards progress, but I'm only one person, right? We find like one little story here and there, but I think it's when it comes to the whole system and institutions, it's about the policies. We need to change our policies and our systems and institutions and ways of doing things, because we're a new society. It's 2023 and we have a long way to go. And also, we see the amount of cultural events and workshops that is put by new businesses, right, that are led by executive directors who are new Mainers, first generation Americans, etc. We see that it's for all the community members, that we see many older generation Mainers contribute and join and even get hired by these organizations and new startups. So that itself is success. So we see a lot of success in the economic lens, but we may not see in the other representatives and, in our government, we don't see that. And in our schools, we don't see that. There is such a challenge of trying to hire more teachers of color and immigrant teachers, new Mainer teachers, but it's so difficult and students are having such a hard time. So that's also something else that we need to work on, and it's a statewide thing. It's not only a Lewiston thing, but I'll stop there. I can go on forever, clearly.
Thank you, Safiya. Yeah, and so that's a good segue to Kristina, who works for an organization that is kind of an amalgamation of different municipalities. So, Kristina, with the framework of what can Mainers do to welcome current and future migrants, I'll lead with a quote from Hamdi Ulakaya, who is the founder and CEO of Chobani, the yogurt company. And he says, as climate change drives more and more people to leave their homes and become displaced, protection through safe and legal pathways is critical. And so, Kristina, we had a question from the audience, from someone named Kelsey, that says, with likely increases of migration to Maine due to climate change, what infrastructure improvements and changes should be prioritized in order to accommodate these changes? And so, Kristina, I know you have a few slides to share, as well as some information about what the kind of work that GPCOG is doing to get people ready.
Great. Thank you. Can you see and hear me? Yeah, great. All right. Well, I'll run through a few slides. And the question that was just posed and that Tobin asked me before this was really, can you provide some information about what is happening with climate migration in Maine? And it's the type of question that our organization loves to be asked. And we try to figure out what kind of data we can provide. And, the short answer here is that we don't know much for sure yet, but we've seen the beginning of some trends, and we certainly know what's happening with climate change around the world and within the United States. But we do know that we are really unprepared for a large amount of growth in the state, And we also know what to do to prepare for that growth. And whether we end up getting a large number of new people joining us in Maine or not, we still need to take some of these steps for the people that live here and for the people that we do know will be migrating to Maine. So I just have a brief set of slides that really are here to set the table around what's happening and to speak specifically to kind of the infrastructure needs that we have to make sure that we can welcome people not only with our hearts, but also with places to live and ways to get around. So these are the communities that we serve, and our job is really to help cities and towns work together to do the things that they can't do by themselves. And that includes looking into the future and anticipating disruptions like the pandemic or like an economic disruption. In my opinion, I think that climate is going to be one of the biggest disruptors to Maine in the future. This next slide just shows you where the habitable areas are in the United States right now. And I'm going to show you what happens in 2070, and you can see that it's moving northward. If I were to show you a global map, what you would see is shrinking levels of habitable places all around the globe. And so it's quite possible that we will have migration that's coming domestically as well as around the globe. And, you know, the animals and plants already know this. They're moving north. People tend to be a little bit more sticky, although, you know, as Crystal and Safiya talked about, there's a lot of disruption that's happening around the world, and it's climate related. It's also related to conflict. It's related to other things as well. And people do get forced to leave where they're living. But that's a big disruption to a family, and that's partly why we don't know exactly how many people will be coming to Maine. So as we know that the animals and the plants are responding to what's happening in the natural environment, we also know that people really respond to costs. And just this week, Axios published these interesting maps, which are showing what the insurance industry already knows about properties. And there are properties all over the country that the insurance is either going up or they're not going to be insured anymore. And it can be from fire, it can be from flood. And here the green one even shows you from wind. But we also have a lot of places that are going to be experiencing some flooding, including Maine. But this has led us at GBCOG to believe that Maine may be more climate safe. It's not climate safe, but more climate safe than other places. And in many ways, we're really lucky to be where we are. And we've been thinking about Maine for a long time, all of us, I'm sure, and we think of ourselves as kind of slow growing. We're graying. We don't have many jobs. We've been losing people. That trend reversed during the pandemic. But I think a lot of folks in Maine still think of us as a state that just doesn't have that many people. It doesn't have a ton of potential economically. But given what happened during the pandemic, we saw people that came in, and I'm sure all of you have anecdotal examples of families that moved here from other parts of the country, or a lot from Massachusetts and New York, and came here because they could work remote, or they felt more safe, or just, you know, they just didn't want to live where they were anymore. We've also had asylum seekers that have started to come in greater numbers to the greater Portland area. And as we've seen this growth, I think there's a new narrative that we all should adopt in Maine, which is first that we might be more climate safe. We might have, you know, less harm come to us in other places, and we may want to share that protection with other people. We have a lot of water. And water is going to be one of the scarcest resources as the climate changes, and we have a wonderful quality of life. So this could be kind of the new thing where we were selling Maine, and it could be a great thing to have more people. We know we have a lot of jobs that need to be filled. We know that we need more diversity. And I personally think it's very exciting to think about what kind of growth potential we have. But we do have a big issue in that we don't totally know what the data is going to say. We're working on it. But we do know that we are not prepared. even just the small numbers of people that have arrived during the pandemic and with new asylum seekers kind of tipped us over into a housing crisis. It was bad with housing before, and we have a very unaffordable market, but we've been struggling to find shelter for people, even short-term emergency shelter, never mind longer-term housing that keeps people safe and provides stability. And that's not just for new people, right? That's also for lots of people in Maine who are getting priced out of the market. And we also know that our housing has kind of scattered itself across the countryside, and that makes it more expensive for people to live because they have to own a car. It eats up our open land. I mean, Crystal talked about the importance of crops and food security, and that's something that Maine has right now. But if we keep on sprawling with our housing development, we're eating up those precious resources that we're going to need for a more resilient Maine in a climate future. So we have done some work, and Tobin, I'm almost done here, to look at where housing can go and where we can grow. We've identified 30 places throughout our region that are ripe for new growth, that can absorb new housing. We know that regionally we have to add 24,000 new homes by 2030, which is a staggering number, in order to take care of people that are here already and anticipate just a small amount of growth. If we were to get a lot more growth suddenly, then we are really going to be caught quite flat-footed. And the housing needs to be near things, can't just be out in the countryside, and it also needs to be targeted for lower and middle income people. We've been thinking about this housing crisis in the context of welcoming asylum seekers. We have a Safe in Maine fund that we've set up. We've been working with people to help them get transportation, and also working to help house people. And so the parting thought here that I'll leave is that Maine is a great home, and it can be a home for more people. And it should be a place where we're welcoming the people that can help build our future. And we need some changes to our infrastructure, more housing, more public transportation, but we also need some changes to our mindset so that we in Maine can really open our arms to this great possibility. So that's what I've got, Tobin.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristina. So, kind of building off that, and then I'm just going to, open the floor to the panel, to whoever has an idea. In order to become a true, welcome home, as the state sign says, how can we work on shifting the mindset of Mainers that might be reluctant to change? To speak nothing of immigration or new demographics, but just like more housing, more different infrastructure. And so just do any of the panelists have any ideas on, how we can shift that mindset a little bit from one of scarcity to one of welcoming?
Yeah, I think it really starts at the community level and projects like what Kristina is sharing. And I was glad to see that it said that prioritizing low and middle income people. And I think even more than that, prioritizing immigrants and prioritizing climate migrants, because one of the things that we saw during the pandemic, and I'm also glad that you shared about, that companies know this, right? Insurance companies know ahead of when we know, and that means that wealthy people also know, right? And what we saw during the pandemic was so much of our good land to grow food was purchased, was bought up. And so one of the things that I think about when I'm getting scared about climate devastation is, where are we going to go? And so I think when we're making these plans, thinking about how are we ensuring that not only housing developments, but our land where we're growing foods, how are we protecting those so that we can all have access? And how are we prioritizing, again, not just low income, but specifically immigrants? Because I think, one thing we see across all of our fights, right, with healthcare and expansion of benefits, is that there's this idea that it's that we're doing them a favor, when really, as I said at the beginning, it's our obligation, it's our duty to ensure that these basic human rights are being met.
I think there are many ways we can shift minds. There's always, when it comes to immigration, even at the national level, there's the concept, of the economy, right? It boosts our economy. We need to let immigrants in because of, jobs, etc. But I think there's more to that. I think we're just good. We change as individuals if we have more diversity, more people from different walks of life and different lived experiences, right? Our kids are better for it. Our workplaces are better for it. The housing is better for it. There's more houses are created, more jobs are created, more businesses are created, etc. So, like, looking at our schools right now, Lewiston has such a high diversity of public schools. It wasn't like that. And then we won many state championships in 2016. That has never happened before, right? And because of, the Somali boys and because of the new Mainer boys, the players, they took Lewiston and Lewiston High School to state championships again and again and again. And there was even books written about it. There was a movie written about it, right? So, and then also with my election, that made international news. Like, what? So, right, like, of course, the economy, and of course boosting jobs, etc. But there's so many other things that we can't put into metrics and numbers that we don't see in the that immigrants contribute. But in terms of, also, I wanted to speak about climate change and the new Mainer population, especially from the culture and, from my background as Somali and as a new Mainer, a lot of the people, climate change is not the front of their minds, to be honest. A lot of the time is putting food on their kid, on the table, and a roof over their head, and trying to get their kids out of trouble from school. And many of the boys are dealing with many, school problems, and there's, especially with youth, and they're having a culture clash or a culture shock, trying to fit into the American society while also trying to have their Somali culture or their back home roots still intact with them. And because we see there's so many difficulties and challenges with the school age kids. But so climate change, though, it's not in the front of their minds. Many people did immigrate to the States and to Maine specifically because of climate migration. Like Somalia, we continue to have drought, humanitarian crisis again and again and again. But many immigrants can conceptualize, so, I don't want to generalize, but the people that I've spoken with, they can't conceptualize what climate change is, what climate migration is. They may say, oh, because we haven't seen rain for a long time, kind of thing, but they can't do that. So when we talk about it, we try to talk about how can we integrate and try to support frontline communities and vulnerable communities when it comes to climate change and climate migration. We need to use a specific framing and a simpler language that's understandable to them, and find ways of community engagement and community conversation. There's many climate organizations in our state and state agencies, even at the federal level, trying to do work around climate change and trying to bring on and center the narrative around low income, communities and frontline communities. But again, we don't see all the narratives presented in this conversation because people are not really intentionally brought in, and we shouldn't be using too much science language, and we need to look at from the social impact when it comes to frontline communities. So I just want to say we need to really think about the framing and the kind of conversation we have when we talk about climate change.
Yeah, and thank you, Safiya, for sharing, those stories about like the state titles for Lewiston High and stuff like that. So, that's something that we see at Merck quite a bit is, what benefits the immigrant communities would benefit, Mainers in general. If you have more housing that's provided for immigrants, you have more housing for everyone. If you have better health care for immigrants, you have better health care for everyone. And so that kind of speaks to, we had a question from the audience or a comment from the audience saying, I wonder about the intersection and perceived conflict between supporting migrants and anti-poverty assistance for folks who were born here. I work with unhoused folks, and often there's a lot of misconceptions about the human rights and historical responsibility versus the cost and accessibility of critical government care for all types of struggling people. And so, we feel that, what's just for immigrant communities is also good for Mainers in general. And so, kind of with that framework, my next question to the panelists, thanks to Josh for submitting that thought, is if you had a magic wand and you could wave the magic wand and you would have any change or any policy change in the state of Maine, what kind of solution would you come up with, whether it's more housing or adjusting to rising sea levels, transportation, immigration? If you had any sort of policy change that could adjust to climate migration, what would you like to see happen? How would you like the state to respond?
The audio is a little tough, but I think the question was, if you had a magic wand, what would be the policy solution to help with climate migration? Is that right, Tobin? Yeah. Okay. Should I kick off? Or Safiya, Crystal, you got something you want to kick in? Okay, I'll just say, Tobin, I think what I heard about your framing, that the policies really need to be good for everybody. And from our perspective, we've got a real housing crisis. And so I would kind of double down on housing as being the issue that we all need to work together to solve. It's a state level issue. It's a federal issue. It's a city and town municipal issue. And it's also an issue that everybody here on the call can make a difference on by standing up for good housing proposals in your community, because that's how we actually can get things built. And that housing, as Crystal said before, it really does need to be for low and moderate income as best we possibly can, because that's the missing middle right now. We've got, a lot of higher end properties that have been built, particularly during the pandemic, as people came here that were wealthier and were able to afford those properties. And Mainers of all backgrounds have been squeezed out of the market. And renters in particular have really suffered. So to the extent that we can build more housing, that would be great for the folks that live here. That would be great to be able to have more room for people that want to move here.
I can't just pick one. There's just so many. It's hard. I think one that comes to my mind that's not a specific policy area is more of like an intentional integration for all people, whether that's people who are coming from other states, whether it's new Mainers or asylum seekers, etc. How do we welcome new people, have young people stay in our state as well? That means more jobs, more especially I work a lot with youth, so more like mentoring opportunities for youth, more jobs after high school for youth. So and it's really about like the system at the municipal level, the systems at the school level. Many times they're hard to move, and they're resistant to change. So how do we take a step back as a state, and right, as policymakers, as administrators, and really try to change these systems to make it more equitable for all people, so that they are able to live and to thrive in our state for generations to come. And that looks like from any sector, from employment to school to housing, because we have so much more work to do.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to focus on housing, and I think I want to talk a little bit about organizing instead of policy. That I think, okay, we've known for a long time that it's been a housing crisis decade after decade in Maine. I moved back from college 10 years ago. When I first started renting an apartment, it cost $800 for a 2-bedroom, and now that's $3,000 in Portland, right? And if you look back at articles from the 80s, they talked about housing crisis. So I don't think that it's a lack of solutions or knowing what it is that we need to do, but I think it's about getting us, all poor people, organized. And I think one thing that's been happening for such a long time is us kind of blaming or passing things off on poor white people in Maine. And what we need to do is organize with people and talk with them about their struggles, so that, immigrants and poor whites struggling with the same thing can be on the same page and move our lawmakers to do something. And so for the people on this call who are white progressives, white liberals, white people who care about these issues, who care about immigrants, you need to go have conversations with poor white neighbors about what it is that they're struggling with, and why do they maybe, hold some of these doubts, hold some of these grudges. And right, it's because of messages that they've been fed, and it's about unmet needs. And we need to address all of those needs. And it's not our jobs as brown people or as immigrants or people who are also struggling to start those conversations and work through that pain. But then, when people have a space to be heard and can work through, we can come together and organize for the things that we want, instead of feeling like we're fighting for the same scraps of resources.
All right, thank you all. And I'll keep my video off in hopes that makes the audio a little bit less choppy. Thank you, Safiya, for discussing the schools. We actually had a question come in from Lena about how Maine schools can better support young climate migrants. So thank you, Safiya, for addressing that. And then Crystal and Kristina, if either of y'all have any response to that, feel free. But then the last question that I have, and to the audience, feel free to submit any questions that you still have to our panelist questions person, Amy. The last question that I have for everyone is, what would you like the takeaway message to be, to Mainers to hear about climate migration? And Crystal, you kind of, touched on that in your last remarks, but just any, what's your takeaway message for the folks that might be listening in on this call or watch the recording, or anybody that comes across this topic? What would you like them to know?
I think that we all need to educate ourselves more on root causes of why people are coming, and not stop at corruption and violence, but think more deeply about why there's corruption and violence in our countries, and why there's more devastating impacts of climate devastation there. And not wait for calls like these, right? Like, you can convene your own panel in your communities, and you can start talking to people. And yeah, I think that, all kinds of learning spaces are great, but we also need to act, even if it's messy, even if we don't know what we're doing. That's what I do, and that's how I started doing this work, right? It's just trial and error, and we all need to participate.
I think my takeaway for folks would be that it would be very useful for us all to prepare for potentially pretty big changes in Maine, and to try to get ahead of the curve so we're not scrambling in a responsive nature. And I think a lot about infrastructure, and I fear that we don't have enough infrastructure to absorb the potential growth that we have. And if we can get ahead of it, it's great for everybody. It's not just about welcoming immigrants, it's about helping the folks that live here have more affordable places, have easier ways to get around, have access to open space and good food. And if we can do that planning and kind of shift that mentality that we're a slow growth state and nothing's ever going to change, to saying, there could be some pretty big waves coming our way, and let's do our best to lock arms and figure out how we're going to prepare for that change.
And just quickly, I want to echo both of them, but especially just being open-minded, really. I think majority of Mainers so far had, everybody has been very welcoming, and we've seen it during the asylum seeker crisis, during the pandemic, how many people open their homes. But we definitely need to, better our infrastructure, to have more people come in and that we're able to take in. So that, and being very open-minded, would go a long way.
All right. Thank you all very much for those insights. Michelle or Amy from Maine Climate Action Now, do you all have any questions for our panelists before we wrap up tonight?
This is Amy, and I've been thinking about how we are working so hard as communities in Maine on resilience and adaptation to climate change. Like, we really are focusing on that. We have a state climate action plan, and it really seems that this should be wound into that. Like, everything we're talking about tonight, as you're all saying, it is more than, it is a mind shift, and it is a infrastructure shift. Like, we have to bring that all on. But I really appreciate things, Crystal, you're saying. It's really asking ourselves questions that I think that you've been forefronting. And how do we bring that? I guess, how do we bring ourselves to the places that are open to us right now in the state in terms of adaptation, mitigation, and kind of expand the conversations and expand the thinking? That's, I guess, I don't know if there's one answer, but I guess I'm just opening this for thoughts on that, because there are lots of opportunities with a state like ours that has a climate action plan, or the cities of like Portland and South Portland have climate action plans. How can we bring thinking about people who are not yet here, who are going to probably come, as Kristina's pointed out to us? How can we bring that thinking into the same conversations we're having about protecting ourselves from climate change?
Crystal, I can see your wheels are turning there. One thought that I had at GBCOG, when we think about resilience, there's of course the infrastructure resilience, like making sure that the coast has enough areas for the water to flow in, and the wetlands are there, and we've got enough preserved. There's also, just where people are building, to make sure that where we're building are places that are going to be climate safe in the future. But the other really key part of resilience, which I think both Safiya and Crystal have touched on, although we haven't talked about that, is knowing one another and being networked together. So like real community resilience is about understanding one another, appreciating one another, building relationships with people that you don't normally socialize with or come across in your workplace. And, just having a bunch of people on speed dial that can help move resources and move people in the event of a disaster or a prolonged stress, which is most likely in our future in Maine. And so as we're thinking about how to build that into the planning that's going on at the state level and at the local level, I think it's very important for us to remember that as a small state in Maine, we have a lot of advantages over a lot of other places that I've lived, where it's you can call one another pretty easily. We are pretty well networked because we're pretty small, and we're also a fairly kind place where relationships tend to live for a long time, and there aren't a lot of I would say bridge burners in our community that I've seen. So I think that's an important component, that we don't lose the people aspect of resilience, even as we're talking about the infrastructure. Crystal, I'd love to know what's in your head about that. I could see you thinking about it.
I think it's a lot of what you already said. I'm just thinking about how, each time a crisis has come up in the past 10 years, we're only thinking a year or two ahead, right? And we really need to have a long plan, 10 years, 20 years, and be building for that, and not sort of just funding through the next year. And then we'll see next year, and we'll see next year. And I think that, we're not taking bold steps to really plan for the future, and we're always pinching pennies. And I think another thing to get more everyday ordinary people into the conversation is helping us as communities to understand money and budget, so that we can say with authority and with certainty what we mean, like how we can take abstract ideas to concretely what we want and how much it's going to cost. But I feel like it can often be scary for people to engage, because we don't deal on a regular basis in the millions or billions of dollars. So it feels hard to engage in those conversations, but it's important that we do. And without having, more confidence and more ability to talk about money, we can't help shape what we want the future to look like here. And, even with the current housing crisis, it's only like, how do we just get over this hump? But now, not how are we going to be with each other forever? And I think that the truth is we don't have a choice, right? So we can either decide now that we who care and want to do it with intentionality, we shape it now, or when we get there, we're all going to be impacted anyway, and we're just going to have to deal with it. And what will happen is this, again, the same thing we see in every crisis. When I went to the grocery store the week that, a case of COVID was popping up here and there and everywhere, the shelves were empty. And the first thing that I thought was, poor people are going to die, right? Like if no more food comes ever again and they didn't get to hoard it, like what will happen? And I feel the same about this. If we don't get to decide together now, then the decision will be made for us.
It's very, very good points, to be sure. And then I guess we've got one last question from the audience. Philip has asked, are there any examples of communities that have been setting an example of how to plan for climate migration, and what kind of supports, whether it's financial, technical, etc., do smaller communities need to help prepare for what's to come?
It's a great question. And I would just say, this is really a new field, calling climate migration. There's been some conversation that it's happening, but as I said, we don't know for sure. There's just not enough data, and the way that planners work is we look backwards in order to project forwards, but we're in kind of unprecedented times. Like we couldn't have predicted at GPCOG the in-migration that we would get from the pandemic, just because it was just one of many, many scenarios. And I think all the planning agencies across the country are really struggling with this to understand what is going to be the magnitude of the migration. We just don't know, and we don't have tools that can help us figure it out. So I know there are some cities that are starting to market themselves as climate havens. Come to us, right? They have a workforce shortage, and they're like, we're going to be more climate safe than other places. Come, they tend to be in the Midwest, the ones that I know about. So there's some marketing that's happening. But in terms of like really good planning around this, I think it's hard. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. It just means that we have to do it with an incredible amount of uncertainty. So, and then in terms of smaller communities, smaller communities, they tend to have less capacity. Many of them don't have planners, professional planning staff. And they tend to be, unfortunately, in a reactive mode a lot. I mean, maybe the world isn't in a reactive mode, and small towns are not any exception to that. But the state has been doing some good work on toolkits. There's a resilience partnership that's coming out of the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and Future that's having some really great impacts with small communities as they start to think about climate resilience and about climate action. But I would say I have colleagues all over the state that are starting to think about this. There are councils of government throughout Maine, and we hope to all be resources to the smaller towns. So certainly make that connection.
Yeah, I think I would just say that I think that this responding to these types of crises require, like municipal level, state level, and working within mainstream structures and infrastructure response, but also alternative infrastructures. And so I think there are lots of communities, including immigrants and Wabanaki communities here in Maine that are, going back to their roots and rediscovering indigenous foodways and figuring out ways that we can take care of ourselves and not have to solely rely on systems that choose for us, so that we can have agency and we can take care of one another. And those are who are most vulnerable.
I'll just quickly add to that. I think I am not sure what city or town in Maine is, doing a good job to prepare for climate migration. But I think looking at the global community as well as the national, what have cities and municipalities and towns across the country have done, and learning from them as well would really be beneficial for us in the long run as well.
Great, thank you all. So we're right in an hour. It looks like we're out of questions. So I just want to say thank you so much to Kristina from GPCOG, to Crystal from Presente, Maine, and to Safiya from Community Organizing Alliance. Also, thank you to Amy and Michelle from Maine Climate Action Now for organizing this. And thank you to everyone that joined us today. Apologies for my poor audio. Thank you for your patience with that. Thank you for joining us for this enriching conversation. And have a wonderful evening. Thank you all.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.